Theresa May has outlined her plans for Brexit/Lexit. She has decided to cast herself in the role of Aethelstan, pronounced Leicester Square for American listeners. Aethelstan was the great Anglo-Saxon king who became the first emperor of Britain and was famous for winning the Great Battle, where he, by some accounts, took on the kings of Scotland, Ireland and English rebels and beat them all. The battle alternatively is known as the Battle of Five Kings and is supposedly the basis of the Tolkien story. And to prove he was master of all he surveyed, he would get all his soldiers and all his ships and sail round the coast of the British Isles once a year to warn off invaders. Of course, Mrs. May's announcement has been met with searing counter-argument by the political left, like that latter-day Eric Hobsbawm Lily Allen, who tweeted, "A global Britain would be good, but the world still hates us 'cause slavery." Speaking of slavery, who said this? "Life is almost intolerable if one does not want to be his abject slave. His party, his followers, and admirers are 50 times worse than himself. One wants to utter a cry of liberation, and if it were heard, what a deep sigh of relief there would be." That was, of course, our dearest Vicky, the Crown Princess of Prussia, speaking of Otto von Bismarck, who the historian Golo Mann describes thus: "As those who despise the human race often do, he surrounded himself with men who more or less deserved to be sneered at, and he repulsed those of independent mind or firm character and intelligence." Which brings me to Serbia's troll train, linked below. The Daily Mail has a marvellous picture of this Eastern Orthodox cathedral on wheels, linked below. It is worth reminding ourselves of why the situation in Kosovo exists, without getting bogged down in grand talk of ethno-nationalism, which will inevitably lead to criticism of Woodrow Wilson, his odd notion of self-determination, and his proclivity towards scientific racism. This link is to a 1999 article in Crisis magazine, linked below, and it makes the case rather nicely, as does Christopher Hitchens on C-SPAN, for whom I don't have a link, as it was an observation in a wider discussion, though it shouldn't stop you looking for it on YouTube, if only for the pleasure of saying, "Oh, I'd forgotten all about that." A brief reminder. Drudge Report broke the story of Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky on January 17, 1998. It appeared in the Washington Post 4 days later. On January 27, 1998, Hillary Clinton appeared on the NBC Today programme to denounce it as a vast right-wing conspiracy. The story gains traction. In July, the stained dress is handed over. In August, Bill appears before a grand jury, and in December he is impeached. As the Crisis article points out, Iraq was bombed at the time of the scandal breaking. In August, there were attacks in Sudan and Afghanistan, and in the autumn, as impeachment loomed, Clinton threatened to bomb Iraq again. The Sudanese attack being the famous Al-Shifa pharmaceutical plant, linked below, which was either making aspirin or chemical weapons. And throughout this period, NATO was increasingly getting involved in Kosovo, having won the Bosnian War, which curiously followed a similar timetable of intervention based on other Clinton scandals, with the final Kosovo bombing campaign starting in March and lasting until June, which was handy, as in April, while Serbs ducked bombs and the Chinese complained about their embassy, Clinton was fined by a federal judge for failing to testify truthfully in the Paula Jones sexual harassment case, with the matter being referred to the Arkansas Supreme Court. And while we're on the subject of the Clintons, it's worth watching the interview with Charles Ortel talking about the Clinton Foundation on Lionel Nation, link below. Apparently the fraud is now above $1 trillion. Yes, I know, get on with it. Something that caused my ears to prick up during the Theresa May speech was this. Britain has led Europe on the measures needed to keep our continent secure. Whether it is implementing sanctions against Russia following its action in Crimea, working for peace and stability in the Balkans, or securing Europe's external border. Given the effect on Europe these Russian sanctions have had, see Sir Humphrey Appleby's views on Britain's role in Europe, linked below, I wondered if this was her getting in a bit of a dig. This Commission report, linked below, gives an estimate to the effect sanctions have had on the EU, with estimates of up to €90 billion in lost trade, 2 million lost jobs, and a rise in gas prices of up to $3, which is not bad, assuming you're not in Europe, when you consider these sanctions were imposed by Obama using an executive order, a device originally intended to buy onions and napkins without bothering the Congress. Which oddly brings me back to the reason I started looking into this, namely the British-Russian Arms Treaty, linked below, that was agreed in January 2014, for I was seeking to find something, anything, that might explain how two countries could go from agreeing to cooperate in the development of armaments to the brink of war in such a short space of time. My first thought was that it might have something to do with the Syrian conflict, and whilst it is true the fighting did widen around this time to bring in the Kurds, it doesn't really explain an escalation to bring in the Ukraine and Russia. Obviously, from a strategic point of view, dragging Ukraine into the war could make sense, particularly if you're losing, which clearly was the case, given that Assad was still there 3 years into the fighting, the Russians still had their naval base, the money grab in Cyprus had been largely a flop, linked below, and unlike the rest of the so-called Arab Spring, the Syrian popular uprising was dragging on, without an end in sight. Thus, it makes some sense to grab Ukraine, and by extension the Crimea, so depriving the Russians of the military logic of having the Syrian naval base. If they lose their main Black Sea naval base, then the need for the Syrian base is, well, lessened. It would also have the added advantage of putting an end to the century-and-a-half long efforts of the US, France and Britain to dismantle the Turkish Empire without Russian interference. And of course, for the Citibank-backed President Obama, it would help Citibank investor and Holocaust survivor George Soros, who has long been involved in Ukraine, linked below. That Soros bailed out of Citibank a month later is neither here nor there, linked below. But rather than get into the world of Soros, let's travel back to the year 1878. The Turkish Empire in the Balkans is collapsing. Opposition leader William Gladstone, when not saving fallen women, is railing against the Bashi bazooks who are beheading Christians and raping women. Liberals of all nations are in agreement that the people of the Balkans should follow in the footsteps of Garibaldi and rise up and throw off their chains. So, step forward the Russians to do their 19th century traditional role of saving Europe, as they had done in 1815 and 1848, to fight the Russo-Turkish War. Not that the fighting was limited to the Balkans, there was fighting in the Caucasus too. And my reason for mentioning this is that in 1878 Bismarck stepped in to stop the war in his self-described role as honest peace broker and settled the matters in his favour. It was unfortunate that settling matters in his favour left Europe in a state of instability that ultimately led to the First World War, and it is unfortunate for the Russians, Serbs, Bosnians, etc., that having done all the fighting and dying, they got pretty much nothing. Does this ring a bell? Obviously, whoever dreamed up the Ukrainian adventure is not going to be happy that they too, at the moment, have got a whole lot of nothing. The Russians still hold the vast majority of the minerals, and they hold the commanding naval position in Crimea. Those behind the coup have got a whole lot of wheat fields and the corpse of the Chernobyl power station. Oh, and a military position that roughly matches the Axis powers in 1917. The other thing to notice about Bismarck is that he arranged things so that the military budget was reviewed every 7 years, and every 7 years he would dissolve Parliament, call an election, and guess what? Every 7 years there would be a military threat that required more military spending. Those damned French. Obviously, the problem anyone has when considering the last 8 years is that the Obama presidency was entirely scandal-free, so there is no point looking back to see if there are connections between the numerous wars and what his spotless administration was doing. Theresa May clearly is using the Russian situation as a bargaining chip with regard to Brexit, if only to ward off the sillier claims about Putin being behind Brexit/Lexit. Still, we shall wait and see. And we shall wait and see how long it takes for someone to shoot at the Serbian train, now that the media have highlighted it in an effort to stoke up the tension. Oh, by the way, link below. Mr. Jens Stoltenberg met the State Minister of Georgia on European and Euro-Atlantic integration, Mr. Victor Dolditze, today. Keep it under your hat.